For thousands of years, one of the most debated questions in the intersection of religion, archaeology, and geology has been whether the story of Noah's Ark describes a real historical event, and if it does, whether any physical trace of that event survives somewhere on the surface of the earth. This question is not merely a theological curiosity confined to seminaries and scripture study groups. It has driven major expeditions, funded serious research programs, sparked heated academic controversies, and inspired genuine scientific inquiry that sits uncomfortably at the crossroads between faith and empirical evidence. Most of the scientific establishment has treated the search for Noah's Ark as fringe archaeology at best, a category of investigation contaminated by predetermined conclusions, confirmation bias, and motivated reasoning that has no place in peer-reviewed discourse. But in the mountains of eastern Turkey, in a region so remote, so geologically extraordinary, and so historically layered that serious researchers have been drawn to it repeatedly across decades regardless of their religious convictions, something has been accumulating in the ground that is now forcing the scientific community to reconsider how quickly and casually it dismissed the question. In 2023, and continuing into 2024, a joint Turkish and American research team published findings from the Durupinar site near Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey that shifted the entire conversation in a way that previous claims about Noah's Ark had never managed to achieve. Not because they announced the discovery of an ancient wooden vessel preserved intact on a mountainside, which would be extraordinary, but would also be the kind of extraordinary that immediately invites overwhelming skepticism and accusations of fraud. What they found was simultaneously more subtle and more scientifically defensible, and in some ways more deeply troubling to conventional assumptions, because it could not be dismissed with the standard toolkit of debunking that previous Ark claims had always been defeated by. What the researchers found was chemical evidence, structural evidence, and geological evidence that something happened at that specific site that requires serious explanation, and that the most straightforward explanation available connects uncomfortably well to the oldest and most widely distributed flood narrative in human cultural memory. To understand why the Durupinar site matters, and why it continues to draw researchers who would never ordinarily associate themselves with what has historically been dismissed as pseudo-archaeology, you need to understand what it is, where it is, and why serious people have been paying close attention to it for more than 6 decades. The site is located approximately 3.2 kilometers from Mount Ararat, the massive volcanic mountain that dominates the Arar province of eastern Turkey, and that biblical tradition has long identified as the resting place of Noah's Ark. The Durupinar Formation sits at an elevation of approximately 1,965 meters above sea level, high on a mountainside, in terrain that is geologically active, seismically unstable, seasonally inhospitable, and in many months completely inaccessible due to heavy snowfall and ice. It is not an easy place to do careful science. In 1959, a Turkish military aerial survey of the region captured photographs that showed a striking and unexpected formation in the earth below, an elongated, distinctly boat-shaped depression in the hillside with dimensions that stopped analysts cold when they examined them carefully. The formation measured approximately 157 meters in length. The biblical dimensions of Noah's Ark, described in the book of Genesis in terms of ancient cubits, translate to approximately 150 meters depending on which cubit standard you apply. The standard cubit, the royal cubit, or the long cubit used in different ancient Near Eastern cultures. The correspondence was close enough to attract immediate and serious attention, and persistent enough to sustain that attention across 6 subsequent decades of investigation. American archaeologist Ron Wyatt visited the site in 1977 and became one of its most vocal and controversial proponents, claiming to have identified it definitively as the physical remains of the Ark itself. Wyatt's claims were not accepted by mainstream archaeology, partly because of legitimate methodological concerns about his work, partly because he lacked institutional credentials, and partly because the scientific community was not prepared, and perhaps not willing, to take seriously any investigation premised on the literal historical truth of a biblical narrative. The dismissal was swift and largely unexamined, but the site itself, whatever its ultimate origins, and whatever its relationship to any ancient religious text, was undeniably real. The formation was real. The unusual dimensions were real, and the questions raised by how a boat-shaped depression of those specific measurements came to exist at that specific elevation on a mountainside in eastern Turkey were real questions that did not disappear simply because some of the people asking them were motivated by religious conviction rather than purely secular scientific curiosity. The research that has now generated the current wave of serious scientific attention began in earnest in 2021 when a collaborative team from Istanbul Technical University and the Mount Ararat and Noah's Ark research team, working alongside international partners from multiple disciplines, began applying modern analytical techniques to the Durupinar site in a genuinely systematic way that no previous investigation had managed to attempt. The team included credentialed geologists, soil scientists, geophysicists, and archaeologists whose institutional affiliations were verifiable, whose methodology was transparent, and whose work was explicitly designed to produce results that could withstand the scrutiny of peer review. They were not simply looking for wood, and they were not operating from a conclusion they had already reached. They were conducting an investigation. They understood from the outset that any wooden structure from the period the biblical narrative describes would be between 3,000 and 5,000 years old at minimum, and that organic material of that age, exposed to the kind of geological processes that the Drupanar site had clearly experienced over millennia, volcanic activity, seismic displacement, erosion, freeze-thaw cycles, would almost certainly not survive in any form that could be visually identified as timber. What they were looking for instead was the chemical and physical signature that a large wooden structure would leave behind in the surrounding soil even after the wood itself had long since decomposed, mineralized, or been entirely transformed by geological processes beyond recognition. What the team's soil sampling and chemical analysis revealed in their 2023 published findings stopped the scientific community from treating the Drupanar site with the casual, reflexive dismissal it had previously received. The results were specific, they were measurable, and they were anomalous in ways that demanded explanation. Soil samples taken from within the boat-shaped formation contained something that soil samples from the immediately surrounding terrain did not. The samples showed significantly elevated levels of potassium, the kind of chemical signature that is consistent with the decomposition of large quantities of organic material over an extended period of thousands of years. They also showed evidence of specific clay minerals, particularly kaolinite and elite, appearing in patterns and concentrations that differ substantially from the surrounding geological matrix in ways not easily explained by the natural mineralogical processes of the region. Most significantly, the samples contained what the researchers identified as traces of organic compounds, including substances consistent with the chemical residues of vegetation and, crucially, what appeared to be processed organic material. Processed in this context means wood that had been cut, shaped, or otherwise worked by human hands, as opposed to wood from trees or vegetation that had simply fallen and decomposed naturally in place. The chemical signature of deliberately worked timber is measurably different from the signature of naturally occurring organic decomposition, and what the soil inside the Drupanar formation appeared to show was evidence of the former rather than the latter. The chemical profile of the soil inside the formation was, in the measured and deliberately careful language of the published research, consistent with the presence of organic material that was not naturally occurring in that geological context. This finding does not prove that Noah's Ark rested at Drupanar. The researchers themselves stated this explicitly and repeatedly in their publications, in their public communications, and in their responses to media inquiries. They were careful not to overclaim. But the finding does mean that something happened at that specific location that deposited unusual organic chemistry into the soil in a spatial pattern that directly corresponds to the outline of the boat-shaped formation. Something was there. Something organic, something substantial, something with a chemical composition inconsistent with the natural geological and biological history of the surrounding terrain. And that something was present at a time depth that the researchers' dating analysis places within the range of 3,000 to 5,000 years before the present, a period that corresponds, depending on which chronological tradition you follow and how you interpret the relevant archaeological evidence, to the general time frame that multiple independent cultural traditions associate with catastrophic flood events in the ancient Near East. The convergence of the chemical anomaly, the physical dimensions of the formation, and the time depth of the organic deposits is not something that can be easily explained away by invoking coincidence. The geological context of the Drupanar site adds yet another layer of significance that the 2023 research team addressed carefully and in considerable technical detail. Eastern Turkey in the region of Mount Ararat is one of the most seismically and volcanically active zones in the entire Middle East. The region sits at the convergence of the Eurasian and Arabian tectonic plates, a collision zone where the geological forces are enormous, and the record of past activity is written dramatically in the landscape. The geological record shows evidence of repeated major earthquake and volcanic events throughout the Holocene period, the roughly 12,000 years since the end of the last ice age, during which human civilization has developed. The Drupanar site itself is positioned on a slope, where geological evidence suggests that a significant landslide or mud flow event occurred in the ancient past, an event of considerable scale that could plausibly have buried a large structure and then partially re-exposed portions of it over subsequent centuries of erosion and gradual geological movement. The boat-shaped formation, in the geological interpretation offered by the research team, appears to have been deformed and structurally displaced by exactly these kinds of tectonic and erosional processes over time, which would account for its current compressed shape and somewhat irregular orientation, without requiring the structure itself to have arrived at its current position under any improbable or miraculous circumstances. The geology explains how something large could end up buried there. What the geology cannot explain is what that large thing originally was. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site, conducted as part of the 2021 to 2023 research program, produced subsurface images that the team describes as showing a series of parallel internal structures beneath the surface of the formation at regular intervals. These structures, which the radar imaging reveals as anomalies in the subsurface density profile of the site, are positioned in a pattern that the researchers argue is consistent with the internal structural framework of a large wooden vessel. Specifically, the kind of regular rib and beam construction that would be expected in a large ancient boat built according to the shipbuilding traditions of the ancient Near East. The radar images are not photographs. They are density maps generated by the behavior of radar pulses as they reflect from subsurface materials of different compositions and densities. Interpreting these maps requires specialized expertise and considerable professional judgment, and the team's interpretation that the detected anomalies represent structural remnants of a deliberately built object rather than naturally occurring geological features is contested by other researchers who believe the patterns observed are consistent with known forms of natural geological stratification in this specific type of volcanic and sedimentary terrain. This interpretive dispute represents the current state of the scientific debate, and it is important to understand that it is a genuine dispute, not a clear-cut case of one side being obviously right and the other obviously wrong. The researchers who conducted the 2023 analysis are not making irresponsible or sensationalized claims. They are not saying they have found Noah's Ark. They are saying that they have found anomalous chemistry and anomalous subsurface structures at a site whose dimensions correspond remarkably closely to the biblical description of the Ark, and that the most parsimonious explanation for the combination of anomalies they have documented is the presence of a large ancient structure of organic composition that once occupied that space. Their critics, meanwhile, are not saying the anomalies do not exist. They are saying that the rich and complex geological history of the site provides alternative natural explanations for the observed patterns that do not require positing a built structure, and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence that the current data set, however genuinely interesting, does not yet fully provide. What is significant about this ongoing debate is that it is a real scientific debate, conducted with real data between researchers who have actually examined the physical evidence firsthand. This is categorically and fundamentally different from the entire previous history of Noah's Ark claims, which typically involved anecdotal reports of wooden structures glimpsed through mountain mists, photographs of ambiguous rocky objects that could be interpreted as almost anything, and testimonial accounts from individuals who could not be independently verified or whose conclusions could not be replicated. The Darupanar research is producing publishable, citable data that other researchers can examine, contest, attempt to replicate, and build upon. The question of what lies beneath that formation has moved decisively from the realm of faith-based assertion into the realm of genuine scientific investigation, which is the only domain in which it was ever going to receive an answer grounded in evidence. The broader geological evidence for a catastrophic flood event somewhere in the ancient Near East is considerably more robust than the evidence at any single claimed Ark site, and understanding this broader context helps explain why the search for physical remnants connected to flood narratives is not inherently absurd from a scientific standpoint. It is not merely a matter of religious belief, it is a matter of matching geological evidence to cultural memory. In 1996, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University published research arguing that approximately 7,600 years ago, the Mediterranean Sea catastrophically breached a natural land barrier at what is now the Bosphorus Strait, sending an enormous volume of salt water pouring into the Black Sea basin, which at that time was a freshwater inland lake sitting at a level approximately 150 meters lower than the Mediterranean. The resulting inundation was geologically rapid, potentially flooding the Black Sea shoreline at a rate of up to a mile per day under some modeling scenarios, submerging a vast inhabited landscape and displacing the communities of people who had built their lives along its shores over generations. Ryan and Pittman proposed that this catastrophic event, which would have been experienced by the people caught in its path as an unstoppable, incomprehensible, apparently world-ending disaster, was the underlying historical basis for the flood narratives preserved in ancient Mesopotamian texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh and potentially the Genesis account itself. The Black Sea flood hypothesis remains an active subject of debate among geologists and archaeologists, with some researchers arguing that the available evidence supports a more gradual rather than catastrophic inundation. But the fundamental geological observation that a major flood event reshaped the Black Sea basin sometime during the Middle Holocene period is not seriously contested. What continues to be debated is the rate, the scale, and the precise character of that event, and the separate question of what cultural memory a catastrophic regional inundation of that magnitude might have left embedded in the oral and eventually written traditions of the people who experienced it, or whose immediate ancestors experienced it and passed down the story, is a question that anthropology, comparative archaeology, and comparative mythology have been examining for decades, with results that are collectively compelling even when individually incomplete. The flood narrative is not unique to the biblical tradition, and this is one of the most remarkable and consistently noted facts in the entire history of comparative religion. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in ancient Mesopotamia well before the Genesis text was written down, contains a flood narrative of extraordinary parallel. The Sumerian flood myth, the Hindu story of Manu and the great fish, the ancient Greek myth of Deucalion and his vessel, and dozens of additional flood narratives from cultures across the globe that had no documented historical contact with each other, all describe catastrophic inundations with enough structural similarity that they appear to preserve cultural memory of real events, rather than having been independently invented as pure mythology. The cross-cultural prevalence of flood mythology is one of the oldest and most extensively documented observations in the scholarly study of comparative religion, and the growing geological evidence for multiple major flood events in different regions of the world during the Holocene period gives that observation a physical grounding that purely textual analysis could never provide. The ancient Sumerian city of Ur in what is now southern Iraq, excavated by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley during the 1920s and 1930s, produced what remains one of the most widely discussed pieces of physical evidence for a catastrophic historical flood event in the Mesopotamian heartland. Woolley's excavations revealed a thick layer of water-deposited silt, approximately 3 meters deep beneath the city's main archaeological record, a deposit clearly consistent with a major flood inundation that Woolley himself, with some justifiable excitement, described as direct physical evidence of the biblical flood. Later and more rigorous analysis demonstrated that the deposit was geographically localized and therefore inconsistent with any truly global event, but it remained fully consistent with a catastrophic regional flood of sufficient scale, and sudden violence to have been experienced by the affected population as an apocalyptic event of civilizational proportions, one powerful enough to enter the deepest layers of cultural memory and persist there through generations of oral transmission before being eventually committed to writing. The Tigris and Euphrates river system that flows through the region where the earliest and most sophisticated Mesopotamian civilizations developed is historically prone to catastrophic flooding when particular combinations of conditions align: heavy upstream snowmelt, sustained rainfall, and the funnel-shaped topography of the river valleys. The geological record of the entire Mesopotamian lowland shows evidence of multiple major flood events occurring over the past 10,000 years, some of them clearly dramatic enough in scale to have permanently altered the physical geography of the region. The cuneiform tablets that preserve the Sumerian and Babylonian flood narratives, including the ancient Eridu Genesis text, the Atrahasis epic, and most famously the relevant portions of the Gilgamesh narrative, describe a flood story with specific and striking structural parallels to the Genesis account that have been the subject of intense and productive scholarly analysis since the tablets were first translated and their content understood in the 19th century. The Gilgamesh flood narrative in particular, in which a man named Utnapishtim is instructed by a god to build a large boat, to load it with his family and with animals of every kind, and to survive a catastrophic flood that destroys the remainder of humanity, contains narrative details so closely parallel to the Genesis account that the literary relationship between the two traditions is acknowledged as real by virtually all serious scholars. What continues to be debated is the precise direction of that literary influence, and whether both traditions are independently drawing on the same underlying historical event or on a common mythological archetype that spread organically through the interconnected cultural world of the ancient Near East. What makes the 2023 Darupana research genuinely significant in this vast and complicated context is that it represents the first time that rigorous scientific analysis of a specific physical site has produced anomalous data that actually requires genuine scientific explanation, rather than simply producing photographs of ambiguous geological formations that can be explained away without any serious engagement with the evidence. The chemical signatures documented in the soil analysis are real, quantifiable, reproducible data. The ground-penetrating radar anomalies are real, instrument-recorded data. The question of what originally produced these specific patterns is genuinely and honestly open in a way that no previous claim connected to Noah's Ark ever truly was. The research team has announced that the next and most decisive phase of the investigation will involve targeted physical excavation at specific points within the formation. The precise locations where the ground-penetrating radar data and the chemical soil analysis converge most strongly on the hypothesis that a substantial buried structure is present. That excavation, if it proceeds according to the timeline the researchers have indicated, and if the necessary governmental permissions can be secured, would represent the most direct and conclusive test of the hypothesis that has ever been attempted at any site connected to the flood narrative tradition. Excavation at the points of greatest anomaly, convergence would either produce physical material, worked timber, structural fasteners, artifacts of any kind inconsistent with natural geological deposition, that is consistent with a large ancient constructed object, or it would produce natural geological material that can be fully accounted for by the documented geological processes of the region. Either outcome would be scientifically valuable in different but equally important ways. A negative result would substantially clarify what the pre-excavation data actually does and does not tell us about this site, and would help establish clearer methodological standards for interpreting ground-penetrating radar anomalies in similar geological contexts. A positive result, the physical recovery of worked organic material, structural timber, or any artifact genuinely inconsistent with natural geological processes, would transform the Durupinar investigation from a scientifically promising but unconfirmed anomaly into one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in recorded human history, with implications that would reach far beyond biblical studies or religious scholarship into our fundamental understanding of ancient human capability, ancient maritime technology, and the relationship between catastrophic natural events and the civilizations that experienced them. The political and logistical dimensions of actually conducting that excavation are not straightforward. The Durupinar site is located in a militarily sensitive frontier region of Turkey, near the borders with both Iran and Armenia, and access to it has historically been subject to control by Turkish military authorities who have not always been accommodating to research teams, regardless of their academic credentials or the legitimacy of their scientific objectives. The Turkish government's relationship with the site is complicated by the intersection of religious interests, nationalist symbolism, and scientific credibility concerns that make straightforward large-scale archaeological investigation considerably more politically fraught than it would be at a comparable site in more accessible and less strategically sensitive territory. The research team that produced the 2023 findings was able to conduct its non-invasive investigative work in part because it was framed primarily as geological and soil science research rather than explicitly as an ARC search, which would have attracted an entirely different and considerably more problematic kind of official attention. Formal excavation with heavy equipment and large research teams requires a qualitatively different level of governmental permission that the team has reportedly been actively working to secure through appropriate diplomatic and institutional channels. What sits at the center of all of this, the question that makes the Durupinar research genuinely more than just another episode in a long and often embarrassing history of sensationalized ARC searches, is the question of what it would actually mean for human knowledge and human self-understanding if the excavation were to produce compelling physical evidence of a large ancient constructed object at that site. Not for theology, where the question of the Ark's historical existence has always been inextricably entangled with questions of literal versus metaphorical interpretation of sacred texts that will not be definitively resolved by any archaeological discovery, no matter how dramatic. But for our broader understanding of the ancient world, of ancient navigation and shipbuilding technology, of the capabilities of pre-literate Bronze Age civilizations, of the actual mechanisms by which catastrophic natural events become encoded in the cultural memory and eventually the sacred literature of the peoples who survived them. A real ancient vessel, or even the confirmed and datable remnants of one, at a site in the mountains of eastern Turkey, would raise questions that archaeologists and historians would find inexhaustible. Who built it? When, precisely? With what tools? What materials? What level of technical sophistication? For what purpose was something of those dimensions constructed? And how, by what geological mechanism, did it come to rest at nearly 2,000 meters of elevation on a mountainside in a region that is currently nowhere near navigable water? The answers to those questions, whatever they turned out to be, would illuminate aspects of ancient human capability, ancient environmental conditions, and ancient cultural practice that currently remain poorly understood, perhaps more dramatically than any conventional archaeological find of recent decades. The researchers at Durupinar are not claiming to have discovered the vessel described in the Book of Genesis. They are claiming to have found something genuinely unusual in the ground at a site that has been generating legitimate scientific questions for 60 years, and they are applying the most rigorous modern analytical methods available to define as precisely as possible what that something might be. The evidence they have published is real. The methodology is defensible. The questions it raises are genuine and scientifically serious. Whether the excavation phase, when it eventually proceeds, produces results that confirm or decisively refute the hypothesis of a buried ancient structure, the work currently being done at Durupinar in the 2020s represents the most serious, the most rigorous, and the most methodologically credible scientific engagement with one of the oldest questions in all of human cultural history. And the answer, when it finally comes from the ground itself rather than from tradition or theology or wishful interpretation of ambiguous aerial photographs, will matter in ways both expected and completely unanticipated. Not because it will settle the religious and theological questions that have surrounded the flood narrative for 3,000 years and more, no archaeological find could do that, but because it will tell us something true, something specific, and something grounded in physical evidence about what actually happened in that particular place, at that particular moment in the ancient human past. And in the strange and persistent way that genuinely ancient things have of remaining relevant across every era that follows them, whatever that truth ultimately turns out to be, it will almost certainly prove to be more complicated, more surprising, and more significant than anyone on either side of this debate currently imagines or expects.